I really like playing games on this handheld. It's a good thing I have all my games on my SD card. What's that? You want to see my SD card? Okay, I'll just take this out and... Oh no! Well, that was highly unlikely. Hey there, how's it going? I'm TechDweeb, welcome. Thanks for clicking on the video today. If there's one thing that I've got too many of, it's handhelds. And if there's another thing I've got too many of, it's handheld boxes. And if there's another thing I've got too many of, it's SD cards. And if there's another thing that I have too much of, it's lack of girlfriends. I have too much lack of girlfriends. I don't have enough girlfriends. Send girlfriends is what I'm saying. Here's the thing about handhelds. They're super fun to get, and you turn them on and you set them up all fresh, download your emulators and front end and add your games and start playing them and building up a system that you're proud of with your save games and everything all together on one device. It's a lovely part of the hobby, but another part of the hobby is buying the latest and greatest new thing to add to your pile of handhelds that no one person can possibly need. And when a new doodad comes along, the thought of redoing all that work, re-downloading your emulators and front end and setting it up and adding your games and moving over your save games, doing it all from scratch again is just too much work. Even for tech dweebs like me who like to set up handhelds and have literally nothing else to do with my life. Even for me, that's a pain in the buns if I did that for all my handhelds. So I don't do things that are a pain in the buns. That's why I don't fold my laundry. I just rotate which pile on the floor I'm pulling from. I call it my clothes buffet, and I certainly don't set up each and every handheld from scratch. I'm far too lazy for that. If I had to, I'd probably just stop collecting handhelds altogether and do something else with my YouTube channel. I'm a big fan of bringing SD cards back and forth between devices for so many reasons. Not just because I'm lazy, although that's the main reason, but also because it's the only proper way to bring everything with you between devices, and also it's cheaper because then you don't need multiple big SD cards, you can just have one, and also it's sort of retro feeling. It's almost like back in the day when you'd play a game and you'd have to shove a cartridge into a thing to do it. I kind of like the idea of my library being on a card that needs to be shoved into a slot. It kind of brings back booting from a floppy disk vibes, you know? There are two realms of discussion here, Android and Linux. Android is very simple and straightforward, and Linux is either pretty easy or a confusing mess, depending on the handheld. We're going to start with Android because this is like must-have knowledge. Everyone with an Android handheld should have this in their brain. It's like subscribing to TechDweeb. It's not optional. Here's how it looks. This is my main Android SD card. When I have it plugged in here to my Odin 2 portal, I have all my games, all my save games, my game lists, all the stuff I need. But watch this. I can take this SD card and put it into my iNeo Pocket Ace, and yeah, look at that. Everything comes along for the ride. All my games, my save games, my game lists, it's all here. And when I set up a new Android device, I'll set it up using this SD card, and then I'll be able to use this on that new device too. And then when I'm in the mood to play on this device, I'll put the card in here. And when I'm in the mood to use this one for a while, I'll just put it in here. That's how I do it. I just use one Android SD card and I pop that into whatever doodad I'm using. And I can also clone this SD card if I ever want to have multiple devices with the same stuff. Every now and then I'll clone it just as a backup too. I made a video about how to clone SD cards. Check that out if you want to know how to do that. I also made a video about how I set up Android devices. I did a complete Android guide setup from start to finish with no skip steps. Everything from installing the emulators to setting up the front end and adding your games and configuring the emulators and customizing the front end, scraping the game art, basically everything that I do to set up my SD card. I showed how it's done. So this video today is kind of a part 2 of that video. Because we already have the SD card set up, and now we're going to set up a second device using that same SD card so we can swap it back and forth. 2 handhelds, 1 SD card. There's a rude joke in there somewhere. In that first setup video, I was using this handheld, the RG Slide, which is the one that was sent to me by LitNXT. And by pure coincidence, LitNXT also gave me the new handheld that I'm going to be using in this video, which is this lovely chocolate brown RG477M. They even sent the case for it, which is actually really nice. I made a review about the RG477M. However, one thing that I didn't like was the color. That silver color, it wasn't my thing. And now that I have this dark brown version in my hands, I can confirm that I like this thing way more. Like immediately, the 477M went from a device that I liked but I didn't want to play on very much to a device that I want to dive in and play on a ton. If you're not familiar with the 477M, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the short version is that it is powerful enough to play everything you'd want to play, including GameCube and PS2 and Switch. It has a 4:3 aspect ratio, so it's going to be ideal for retro games, and it has a super premium feel with the metal shell and perfect controls. This is probably the top end 4x3 handheld that you can get right now. LitNXT sells this, and you can buy it from them if you want one. There's a link in the thingy below. I have literally not touched this handheld. It's fresh out of the box, so let's fly through the basic setup, but we'll use this SD card, my primary SD card that I use in all my devices. I have it set up on my RG Slide right now, so we're basically picking up where we left off in the first video. One completely set up device and one fresh device that needs to be set up. The first thing we got to do is go through the initial setup, get to the home screen. Then, like I show in my Android setup video, these Amberlic handhelds come pre-installed with emulators. However, I prefer to install my own stuff. So the first step is to clear out all the emulators that come installed on the device. We're going to start fresh, so we need a blank slate. And when that's done, we can get started by installing our own emulators. Again, this is all covered in my setup guide. Just download RetroArch for the retro stuff, Dolphin for GameCube, PPSSPP for PSP, NetherSX2 for PS2, Sudachi or Eden for Switch, and Azahar for 3DS. And you'll also want to install your front end. In this case, it's ESDE, and check my setup guide video if you don't know how to do any of this. So with everything installed, this is where the magic happens. We can now insert our SD card, the one from our old device, and then we can go through and we got to set up all the emulators the same way that I did in my initial video, which means you're going to set up each emulator and set up the controls and whatever video options you need. And then you're going to load up a game off the SD card just to make sure it's working. When it comes time to add your BIOS files, like NetherSX2 and Sudachi, I actually have those on my SD card, which is where I put them in that first video if you remember. So you can just pick those. You don't need to re-download that stuff. When you set up RetroArch, you're going to set it up the same way that I did in my setup guide. Set whatever options you want and download your cores. However, when it comes time to add the directories for your BIOS and save files and save states, you can pick the folders for those that are on your SD card. This is what I showed you how to do in my setup guide, and you can do the same thing here. Now that we have the setup done, let's start up ESDE. Here, when it asks which ESDE folder we want to use, we're just going to select the one on our SD card. Same thing with the ROMs folder. We have a ROMs folder on our SD card from our previous device, so we'll choose that. And boom, look at that. ESDE starts up and it's set up exactly the way it was before. It has all our games and our front end with the theme and the options that we have set up before. All our game art is there, our favorites list, everything is here. And when you start up a game, your save states are here too. You can pick up right where you left off in your games. Actually, that's kind of a lie. Your save files from RetroArch are on the SD card, and also 3DS and PSP. Those systems keep the saves in a custom folder on where your ROMs are, but Dolphin and NetherSX2 do not keep their saves on the card, and there's no way to set them up that way. However, both of these apps have a way to export the save games, and you can import them on the new device. So if you want to bring your saves between the devices, you can, but it's not stored on the card. And that's not ideal, obviously, not being able just to take the card with you and bring along your save games. Just the way Dolphin and NetherSX2 work, and there's no way around it. So if you want your saves, you're going to need to do that. And so those are the two systems that I don't bother syncing my save games. My RetroArch saves is the main thing that I need. That's where most of my retro systems that I play are. And here's the thing, if I want to go back to my RG Slide now, all I have to do is pop out that card and pop it into the RG Slide. Back in action. And if I want to go to my iNeo Ace, I'll pop it in there, and there we go. All my stuff is on there. How cool is that? You know what? Don't answer that. I know it's super cool. I don't even need to know your opinion on the matter. When it comes to Linux doodads, things get a lot more complicated because there's a million different Linux doodads. Trust me, I counted. And even the same doodad or family of doodads can have multiple different operating systems, and each operating system handles their folders and files differently. And then consider each doodad has its own controls, which may or may not be the same input style as other devices, and they all have different screens. It's not like Android where lots of the system level stuff is handled by the operating system itself. On Linux, it's done through the software for that device. So the idea of passing a single SD card back and forth and having it just work on different Linux devices isn't really a thing. But what is a thing is some Linux devices have 2 SD card slots, and those are designed for this purpose, to have one SD card for the operating system and another SD card for the games and save games and all that stuff that you can swap around. If you have 2 devices made by the same company, like 2 Amberlic devices for example, and you have all your games on a second card, chances are that you can just use that same games card on both devices and it's going to work right away, and it's also going to have the save games on there. However, if you go the custom firmware route, you can create a second games card that you can definitely move between devices. Each device will have to have its own system card because each device has different hardware. The system card isn't interchangeable, but the games card can be. For example, in Knulli, which is a custom OS that runs on all the Amberlic XX devices, along with the TrimUI devices and also the BattleXP G350 and a few others that are in alpha testing, if you want to use a second SD card, you can. I'm going to show you how this works in Knulli, but the same concept also applies to other custom operating systems like ArcOS and Rocknix, and I think MuOS can do it this way, probably others too. Knulli is my OS of choice, so that's what I'm using. This is my RG34XXSP, which I call the Flap Zizzle. It has 2 SD card slots. I have my Knulli system installed on one card, but I can put in a second card to act as my games card. For this, you're going to need an exFAT formatted SD card. You can use Rufus to format your card to exFAT, by the way, and pop that into your second card slot. And in Knulli, you got to go to the main menu and then System Settings, down to Storage, and then pick Storage Device. And you're going to see a list of options here, and you can pick any external, and then you're going to need to reboot the device, and Knulli will configure itself with the SD card as the games card. It will create the game and BIOS directories on there for you. Then you can shut the doodad down and pop that card into your PC and copy over your games and your BIOS files and pop it back into your device, and then you can set up the device how you want, scrape your game art or whatever, get it all working and start playing games, some save games and all that stuff. All that's stored on the card, on the second card. And then if you have another device with Knulli installed, like this RG35XXSP, which I call the Flip Zizzle, you can pop that SD card in there and set the storage to external and reboot, and there you go. All your games and scraped art and save games and all that stuff is on there now. This is great if you have multiple devices running Knulli, because Knulli will use the same format for the directories and stuff on here. However, this card is not going to work if you put it in some other Linux handheld with a different operating system. This is just for Knulli. It'll only work with Knulli. I should also mention that if you want to boot back into Knulli, you're going to need to put the second card back in. Otherwise, it won't boot. Knulli needs the way it's configured to be able to boot. So you're kind of out of luck if you lose your second SD card or whatever. You're going to need to reflash Knulli anyways. For this reason and a few others, I don't bother with swapping SD cards around on my Linux devices. I prefer to have each device to have its own stuff. What I do instead is I have a device that I've chosen as my main device. For me, that's the RG35XX Plus, which I call the Bezazzle. And I just have a backup of all this stuff off the share partition on that device on my PC. I back this up all the time whenever I make a change to my library. And then when I get a new XX device, or whenever I need to flash a new SD card, I'll populate the share partition for the new card with the backup data from my Bezazzle. It's a bit cumbersome, but it works great. I have it down to a science at this point. I mean, maybe I'll make a video about that process for Knulli if you want to see it, just let me know. So obviously there's lots of messy hands-on stuff when it comes to Linux handhelds, and it's really not practical to plan on having shared SD cards between all your Linux devices the way you can on Android. It's just a pain in the buns, so I don't bother because I have better things to do with my time. Like I spend lots of time doing important things like shut up. And that's it. That's all I wanted to show you today. Some tips and tricks about sharing SD cards between Android doodads, and some sort of tips, but mostly warnings about trying to do it with Linux doodads. This video was inspired by a comment that someone left on one of my other videos. They wanted to know how I do this. So if you have ideas for videos that you'd like to see, things that I can explain or help you understand or entertain you with, just let me know in the comments below and maybe I'll make a video about it if you're lucky. Just don't ask me for a foot reveal. You gotta subscribe to my OnlyFans for that. But that's gonna do it from me for today. I'm TechDweeb, thanks for watching. Bye bye.